when people look back at America, and as you have, again, already acknowledged, there's a lot of sinful moments in our past. And as someone that studies history, I chuckle at times when people are like, well, you just don't know. And I'm like, actually, I know the bad better than you do. I can school you on all of the bad and evil things we've done. But the thing I think is significant is, I would say, Frank, you pick any atrocity in American history. And whether you want to talk about like the witch trials, the Indian land removal, slavery, like you pick an atrocity, it doesn't matter. I'm going to ask two questions. How did it come to an end? And who led the opposition? Because this is the other unique thing about America, is without exception, the people that always were opposing the evil, that helped bring an end to the evil, it was always Christians, the church, and pastors.
Ladies and gentlemen, on both spiritual tours that Speaker Mike Johnson gave small groups of us in recent weeks, when we stood before that famous painting of the Declaration of Independence signing, Speaker Johnson talked about how unique the government of America is in very simple terms. He said whenever he teaches this, and by the way, he's an attorney who teaches constitutional law, believe it or not, at Liberty University as the Speaker of the House. Of course, much of it's on video, but he still interacts with students. Anyway, he says he puts three words on a whiteboard. He puts God up top, then the king, then the people below the king. And he says that America was unique in terms of its form of government because it erased the king, but not God, and said that the people had rights that came directly from God. No king gave you rights, no government gave you rights. And of course, our Declaration of Independence says this. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men were created and endowed by their government. No, it doesn't say that. Endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. If there is no God, there are no rights. And so what we want to talk about in this podcast, which is a continuation of the last one with the great Tim Barton, who's back with us, ladies and gentlemen. Here he is with his own audience. The last time, Tim, we were together, we talked about the founding. We talked about Christopher Columbus. We talked about the issue of slavery and how so many lies have been told by people saying, slavery originated in America when that's not the case. In fact, we got rid of it before Britain in many cases. But what about this idea that Speaker Mike Johnson was communicating? Do you agree with him? And can you unpack that idea further, that America is unique in that regard?
Absolutely. We were the first one founded on a set of ideals. And the philosophy of this nation is unlike virtually anywhere else in the world. It was the notion that our rights don't come from a king or from a political body, from the aristocracy. It comes from God. And the primary role of government is to secure those God-given rights, which also now is great because we've given context to what government exists for. Government doesn't exist to give us rights. It exists to secure the rights God gave us, which actually is what you see from the biblical model as well. When you go to, for example, Romans 13, that a lot of Christians want to point to for the government. Well, yes, government was given the sword. Why? To execute justice. The sword does not create laws, it enforces laws. The government does not come up with moral rights and wrongs. It upholds the standard of what God gave. And the founding fathers, as you allude to the second paragraph of the Declaration, where it's kind of the elucidation of this idea, where they said, we hold these truths to be self-evident, which is the Jeffersonian way of saying this is so obvious any dummy should understand this, right? This is a self-evident truth that all men are created equal. Now, this is also going to be important because you tease the fact, I think the last time we were on together, you talked about maybe on this podcast, we get into 3/5 clause from the Constitution. Well, this is important because the founding fathers said, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. So then how could they be equal if they had like slavery and then, the 3/5 compromise? Well, we'll come back to that in a second. Mm-hmm. But the idea that we were equal, why? Because we're all made in God's image. That's Genesis 1:26 and 27, that male and female, he made us in his image. He created us. And that to secure these rights, governments are instituted now, which rights? Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. And that to secure these, governments exist. Every other nation at that time had some kind of government leadership. Usually speaking, it was a king, and king was relative because it might be some kind of sultan or a pharaoh, but you have a headship, and the king determined what rights you did and didn't have. And like this idea of private property, no, not over with England, because the king believed it was all his, and he might grant a lord or a noble some title, and you could have land, and there'd be peasants and serfs working for this lord or noble on this land. This idea that our rights don't come from the king, they come from God, was a revolutionary idea. And it's something that when Jefferson said these truths are self-evident, I've thought about this a lot. Those truths, not only are they not self-evident today, they certainly weren't self-evident then. Right? If you're talking to people around the world in the era of monarchs, and you're saying like, this is an obvious truth that we're all equal. Well, no, you're not. You have classes back then. There's lords and nobles and businessmen and serfs and peasants and slaves. You're not all equal. This idea that we're endowed with certain inalienable rights from our Creator, that's not a self-evident truth. The reality is the monarch would determine who had what rights. So when Jefferson says these truths are self-evident, none of them are obvious or self-evident. In fact, it's all contradictory to what would be the most self-evident thing. And so the question has to arise, then what is Jefferson talking about? Or maybe better, where is it a self-evident truth that those things are real, that there's a God, our rights come from him, and government exists to secure those rights? Those truths are only self-evident to people that know what the Bible says. Because it's the Bible that tells us we're created equal in God's image, that our value doesn't come from our status, our clout. No, it comes from the fact that we are made as image bearers of Christ, that the fact that our rights come from our Creator. You can go back and look, because when God makes institutions, God starts with the individual, and from the individual, he makes families. And then he makes government, he makes a church. Well, if you go back and look, you can argue like the first civil ordinance God gave to man was part of the Noahide laws, the Noahic covenant, where in Genesis 9, Noah gets off the ark and God says, okay, from now on, new law. If man sheds blood, by man his blood is shed. Well, that's God giving what we would consider biblically, that's the first civil ordinance identified in the Bible. But did God give rights before God started giving directives to government? Well, yeah, Adam and Eve had the freedom of speech. They had the freedom of religious choice. They could choose to eat of all of these other trees or the one tree God said not to. And the reason all this matters is when you look at the founding fathers and their ideals were so shaped from a biblical understanding. Today, a lot of people look and think, man, it was so secular, these guys. No. The reason our nation was so different, it was largely an outgrowth of the Protestant Reformation, a return to the Bible, people reading the Bible for themselves and going, man, what has been happening in Europe has not been what the Bible said, and we've gotten it wrong for hundreds or maybe 1,000+ years in some of these areas. We need to restore this. The founding fathers were actually making a move led largely by their pastors, and this is a side tangent. But if you go back and look at the founders' writings, Donald Lutz was a professor at the University of Houston. He did a book called The Origins of American Constitutionalism, and he identified the most quoted source in the founders' writings was the Bible. Then there's people like Alice Baldwin. She started the women's program at Duke University. She was a professor there in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. But in 1928, she wrote a book called The New England Clergy and the American Revolution, and she identified the most significant voice in the founding era was the pastors. And to give credence to this is not even complicated. If you look at what is the most significant major event that happens in America before the Revolution, it's the First Great Awakening. Well, if the most significant thing happening in America before the Revolution is the First Great Awakening, well, then it's not surprising that pastors' voices are very influential, especially in certain regions and certain areas, that certain pastors have a lot of weight and pull and notoriety. And that's kind of what she points out, is that the pastors were the most significant voice for the founding fathers. But in her book, one of the things she says, it's in her conclusion, it's on the third page of her conclusion. Her conclusion is 5 pages. It's super easy to read. But she says there is not a right asserted in the Declaration of Independence which had not been first preached from the American pulpits prior to 1763. And then she goes on to point out, she said, here's some of the pastors, and here's a clause from their sermon, like a paragraph from their sermon, where they actually talk about that right. And she documents that it was pastors who were leading the thinking. And she actually makes the argument that the founding fathers didn't come up with a single unique idea. Instead, they repeated all of the things they'd been learning from these pastors in decades leading up to the moment. But why am I saying all this? Because when you look at the Declaration is one of the most significant and unique governing documents ever done. And a lot of people today, if you're not familiar with Christianity and the Bible or American history, it would be very possible to overlook the origins of those ideas. But if you go back and do a little more deeper dive research, why this declaration was so unique is because the most significant source for the founders was the Bible. The most significant voice for the founders was their pastor. And you literally see it when Jefferson says these truths are self-evident. Well, no, they're not. They're not self-evident to the rest of the world. Like today, Frank, even today, is it obvious that our rights come from God? No, it's not obvious in China. It's not obvious in Russia. It's like, this is not an obvious truth in the world. These are only obvious truths for people that have been schooled and shaped by an understanding of the Bible. But if you're shaped by pastors, if you're shaped by the Bible, then you're going, guys, these are obvious truths. Yes, the reason that our nation has been the most stable, successful, prosperous, and even benevolent nation in the history of the world is because more than anything else, we were not only influenced by Christianity, but we followed biblical principles in the founding and formation of the nation. And as you've said many times, and I will echo time and time again, it's not that America is not full of sin and sinful moments and sinful people. But the reality is every nation's had sinful moments, sinful people, and sin exists in their culture. It's not that America is devoid of sin, but it's that we built on a foundation that nobody else built on from an influence that nobody else was following at that time. And it was a biblical Christian influence that ultimately built this nation. And that's why we've been different than every other nation in the world.
And ladies and gentlemen, anybody that objects to this is assuming a moral standard. By what moral standard are they judging, say, the American founding to be bad, or misjudging it because they have bad information and are relying on bad history? In other words, if you're going to say that we can't trust the founders because they were oppressors or they were slave owners or whatever, you're actually assuming a moral standard when you say that, to say that being an oppressor or being a slave owner is wrong. But that can only be true if God exists. Now, as Christians, we would agree that's wrong. And we would say that, yes, some of the founders were wrong in what they did. But they were the first ones to abolish slavery in the free world, at least in certain states. It took a civil war to get it out of the southern states. But it was the Americans that got rid of it prior to the British, as you said in the last show, Tim, that by 1804, at least half of the colonies, the northern colonies, had abolished slavery 30 years prior to England doing it. And is that the first place in the world that has ever happened, that slavery was abolished?
Where it stuck, yes. There's a few places historically where people would point to other nations and they're like, look, they ended slavery like back in 1400, 1500. And what I would always point out is, wait a second, like what happened 3 years later? Oh yeah, when slavery was reinstituted in their culture. So there were people that tried from a moral perspective to eradicate slavery. It never stuck anywhere until the northern colonies in the 1700s, 1770, 1780, 1790s, until they started doing it. That was the first place it stuck. And again, they were doing it at a time when nobody else in the world at that time was making that charge or challenge. And this is another great point too, is when people look back at America, and as you have again already acknowledged, there's a lot of sinful moments in our past. And as someone that studies history, I chuckle at times when people are like, well, you just don't know. And I'm like, actually, I know the bad better than you do. I can school you on all of the bad and evil things we've done. But the thing I think is significant is, I would say, Frank, you pick any atrocity in American history. And whether you want to talk about like the witch trials, the Indian land removal, slavery, like you pick an atrocity, it doesn't matter. I'm going to ask two questions. How did it come to an end? And who led the opposition? Because this is the other unique thing about America, is without exception, the people that always were opposing the evil, that helped bring an end to the evil, it was always Christians, the church, and pastors. The reason our nation has continued to try to correct when there was immorality, it's not because of secular leftist paganists. It was always because of Christians who, following a moral standard, which, Frank, I love that I get to hang out with you right now. It's so fun. As someone who bought I don't have enough faith to be an atheist back in like the early 2000s. It's super fun having navigated in my own understanding and asking a lot of questions of people like you do so brilliantly. I love the question, well, how do we determine right and wrong? Which is what you ask so often, because people often want to have a subjective moral framework, which doesn't work in reality. But if you have an objective standard, and if you review history honestly, what you recognize is that America is not perfect, but Christianity has been the driving force behind stopping every time there was oppression and evil. It was always Christians leading the opposition, and Christianity is what has made this nation better. Every time we've taken steps in a good moral direction, it's been because of the influence of Christianity. And the more secular we become, or when we have our more secular moments, that's always when you see the increase of oppression, injustice, sin, wickedness, or evil.
And ironically, ladies and gentlemen, I know this is going to sound crazy, but it's true. For those of you that know about the 3/5 clause in the Constitution, that's easy for me to say, the 3/5 clause in the Constitution, which essentially says that slaves were worth 3/5 of a person, is an attempt to eradicate slavery. You say, how so? Can you explain that, Tim?
Yeah. And actually, if I can even clarify, so it doesn't say that they're 3/5 of a person. What it says is you can only count 3/5 of the slave population.
Yeah, let me correct that, because that's what Dred Scott said later.
Correct.
The court case, they misinterpreted to say it was 3/5 of a person. It meant you can only count 3/5 of your slaves for apportionment in Congress, and there's a reason for that. Go ahead.
Yeah, so at the Constitutional Convention, there is already a lot of 1787. So there's already several northern states that have already passed laws abolishing slavery already. And so the abolition movement is very strong, and especially in the northern colonies. And this is also where, like, just historically, you back up and look, there were two primary early colonies in America, Jamestown and Plymouth, and both of them had very different legacies. Jamestown is where you have like the 1619 story, the project. And again, that's very wrong, historically misconstrued, but it's true that the people of Jamestown were not students of the word, that there was a lot of, it's a lot easier to identify more sin and wickedness from Jamestown than the second colony, which was Plymouth. Plymouth were people that were largely trying to find a place to practice their religious freedom. And they were students of the Bible, where William Bradford says there were days that they would read the Bible 6 to 8 hours a day. They were, consumers of the Bible, but because of it, they tried to follow very closely what the Bible said. And I say this because when you get to founding fathers like Sam Adams, he was so proud that he was a descendant of the Puritans. They're the ones that came with John Winthrop right after the Pilgrims, but they're the ones that found the northern section of North America. And so he was always anti-slavery. That's part of his background and heritage, his belief. And this matters because when you come to the Constitutional Convention, we had been 13 united states, but we were 13 independent states that united for the cause of liberty in the American Revolution. But once we get through the American Revolution, you have 13 independent nations, and they're saying, we really need to find a way to work together. And to give, again, more context, at that time, there were different currencies in those different colonies, which at that time were states, but almost like their own nations. So you had different currency in North and South Carolina. You had a different currency in Virginia. And people began to recognize, like, this is kind of hard to navigate our trade, our travel. There were border wars, and they're like, we gotta figure this out. And this is part of what leads to a new constitution. So when they come together, all of these different delegations that come from their various states, they come with their own idea of the way government should operate. And when they come together, nobody's delegation, their ideas are not the same as anybody else's. So New Jersey shows up and they're like, well, New York's idea is dumb. New York's like, Virginia's idea, that's the worst. All they do is disagree. It's not good. And this is the background context that some of the very ardent abolitionist founding fathers were like, we're not having a nation with slavery. Like, that's clear. We're not going to do it. And then some of the southern states were like, wait a second, you can't take away our slaves. And so they started navigating when they get to this bicameral legislative system where you have the House and the Senate, and the House was going to be chosen based on population. The northern guys were like, wait a second, we are not letting you count people in your population if you're not giving them the rights of citizens. You don't get to count them in your population, because that was going to be apportionment of how many congressmen they got. And the more congressmen they had, the more power they were going to have. By the way, it's not all that dissimilar when we look at some states today, where, just as an example, in California, why do we think that in California they are welcoming all of the illegal migrants to move to California? Because they're including them in their census. And then based on the census, they get their congressional representation. Well, right now, California has a lot of apportioned congressmen representing them in Congress that are there because of how many illegal migrants are living in California. This is like the same idea where some of them, the conservative states, are like, wait a second, you shouldn't be able to count illegal immigrants in your census data that gives you more congressmen in Washington, D.C. This is the same argument they had back then, except back then it was enslaved individuals. And so the northern guys said, this is ridiculous. Well, part of what leads to the compromise, you have guys like James Wilson, Roger Sherman, who are trying to help navigate, and they go, right now, the most important step we take is that we come together as a nation. So like, where can we meet the middle ground? This was part of what was known as like a great compromise, was they said, okay, we're not letting you count all your slaves. And right, the abolitionists were like, you can count none of them. We're counting all of them. And so they're negotiating back and forth. And finally, they're like, okay, 3/5 of the slaves you get to count in your population for apportionment in Congress. And what's great about this too, Frank, is when you go back again and study this from original documents, if you go back to some of the early abolitionist leaders, guys like Frederick Douglass, noted abolition leader leading into the Civil War, very loud and vocal voice. And it's interesting that people will point to him on both sides. And sometimes they'll point to him and he's like, look, Frederick Douglass thought the Constitution was a racist document. Well, Frederick Douglass actually did make that argument early on. And this is why knowing the whole story matters, because what I love to ask the questions, hey, so when did he say it was a racist document? And they're like, well, I don't really know. And I'm like, okay, well, it was in his very first autobiography. And they're like, see, it's in his autobiography. And I go, yeah, how many autobiographies did he write? He wrote 3. Why do you write 3 autobiographies? Because when you live an extra 10 years, then you add some more chapters. Well, here's the new edition. So this is my second autobiography. You live 10 more years, you add another edition. What happened between his first and second autobiography is somebody who was an abolitionist but was pro-constitutional, they said, Frederick, you keep saying the Constitution is racist. What is racist in it? And he had never read it for himself. And he went and read it. His second autobiography, he talks about it. He says, this is a glorious liberty document. Nowhere in here does it even mention the word slave. They intentionally left that out. And he starts explaining that once he read it for himself, he realized that what he had thought it was is not what it actually was. And then, by the way, when you read his last autobiography, once you make it past the Civil War and you get to the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendment, where the second autobiography says that we have not yet fulfilled the promises of the Declaration, but we are on our way. And then you get to his third autobiography where he says that we are now fulfilling the promises made in the Declaration that all men are created equal. The reason all this matters is when you actually go back and study it, it's not at all what it's said to be today. And literally the people who, Frederick Douglass, the noted abolitionist Frederick Douglass, even he said that when you read the Constitution, it's a glorious liberty document. This is, by the way, part of what people argue with the 3/5 clause. They're like, well, they said slaves are only 3/5 a person. That's not what they said at all. And it actually was an argument from the northern abolitionists to reduce the amount of population counted, which was going to give Southern slave owners more members of Congress, which would have given them a chance to expand slavery even further. But let me add one more thought, is also in the midst of this, they also write the Northwest Ordinance. Now, the Northwest Ordinance actually was done 2 years earlier. It's approved at that time. But in the Northwest Ordinance, in Article 3, it's very important. Article 3 says that no territory or state shall enter the Union as a slave-holding territory or state. Not only did they say southern states, you only get to count 3/5 of your slaves for population, for apportionment for congressmen, but they said anytime we add on states or territories, we will not allow slavery to expand beyond what it is now. Mm-hmm. That's literally the Northwest Ordinance. Now that stays in place till the Missouri Compromise, and then the southern states begin advocating. So slavery does end up growing, but that's not till the 1820s, 30s, and 40s, and that's well after the founding fathers. So with most things, Frank, a lot of people have repeated things they've heard, and they've never actually gone and looked up and done the research. It's a little bit like when people think that Christianity is so mean and bigoted or blah, blah, blah. And you're like, that's not what actually the Bible teaches. It's not what the verse says. You know, well, Frank, you're not supposed to judge me. Well, that's not what the Bible actually says, right? There's a little more context to that. That's how it is with a lot of these arguments for the founding fathers, that the 3/5 argument was not that slaves are only 3/5 of a person. It was to limit the power the southern states had in Congress to try to stop the advancement of slavery in the nation, which, by the way, they were largely able to do until the 1820s and 30s.
Yeah, and that's the brilliant compromise there is the northern states figured if we could reduce the number of representatives from the South, one day we'll be able to outvote them.
Correct.
And get rid of slavery. If we allow them to count every slave as a citizen, they're going to have more representatives and we're not going to be able to outvote them. So people don't realize, they just read it and they go, oh, well, that's not right. They don't realize the reasoning behind it.
Right.
They had to keep the Union together. And that was the only way they could do it at the time. What were you going to say, Tim?
Well, I would say also they don't even read. They don't read that part of the Constitution. They literally read what somebody wrote about it. They hear a professor. They see something on social media.
Secondary research rather than primary research, which is what you guys are doing because you have the original. Well, we all have the original Constitution. We know what that. But you have original documents from. I mean, do you have any original documents from James Madison? He rewrote a lot of the Constitution.
We sure do. We have a lot from James Madison,
right.
And I mean, literally from all these guys we're talking about, we do. But the thing I would say is, like, anybody watching and listening, don't think that because we have original now, well, we have an unfair advantage almost. Like we can look up things you can't know because almost everything they ever wrote is accessible online.
Yeah, they're reprinted, obviously, or digitized. Right. Yeah.
So we have original handwritten letters, but those are also like high-res scans online, transcript online. Everything's available online. And this is also something like you can get on ChatGPT, you can get on Grok. You can say, hey, look this up for me. And now, obviously, that's a tool that you have to use well because it can give you bad information at times. So ask,
yep.
Right. Ask good questions, do a deeper dive, but this is all accessible information. And so a lot of what we believe because we listened to the first voice we heard instead of going and doing more research. And this is, Frank, for us, one of the things that I encourage everybody is in the midst of asking questions that we need to ask way more questions when we hear a claim. Is it true? How do we know? What's the source? Is there more to the story? Did they say more about that topic or issue? I mean, just some basic questions, but when you start asking basic questions, looking for the information, you can find the truth pretty easily. And what we discover is that the truth, even though it's not very hard to find, it's just largely suppressed because the loudest voices are not saying what's true.
Mm. And one of the reasons we're doing this program, ladies and gentlemen, is to show you what is true from the original documents, and also to counteract this historical revisionist vein that people have been on because they want to control the future. If they can get you to believe that America's evil, then they can also get you to believe we ought to tear the whole thing down. In fact, the new Democratic Socialists of America want to get rid of the president and the United States Senate, right? And they want more government ownership of businesses. Yeah. And this is just communism, this socialism. This is the direction they're going in. And isn't it interesting that it's difficult to build something. That's what creation does. It's very easy to tear something down. You can build a house and take you a year or so. You can tear down a house in 5 minutes if you have the right equipment, right? It's easy to tear something down. In fact, evil is anti-creation. That's what it is. It's anti-creation. It's taking a good thing and degrading it. And by all accounts, if you understand the founding of our country and the documents, not that all the people were perfect, they weren't, but if you understand how unique and how grounded your rights are in something outside yourself, you can only claim that is a good thing. And yet people want to tear it down by lying about what the past is and lying about what the documents are and who the people were behind the documents. So let's cover, if we could, Tim. I know we can't do all of this. There's so much to cover, but it's all in your book. The new book, well, there's two versions. There's a volume 1 and a volume 2. That book right there, Lies, Fortunes, and Sacred Honor, but also The American Story, The Beginnings. You have part 1 and part 2.
Yes. Yeah, and that's actually going to be a whole series. Part 1 goes from Columbus through the American Revolution. Part 2 goes from the Constitution through the first 7 presidents. We're going to have another one coming out in a year or two that's going to go like from Andrew Jackson through Reconstruction, so have the Civil War right in the middle of it. So we're going to try to do it really the whole American story. And then we have spinoffs like the one on the 56 Signers of the Declaration, Lives, Fortunes, and Sacred Honor. So we're going to try to have a sequence, a series that's going to give people the opportunity to go back with original documents and review this. And I know, Frank, we're about to toss to a different direction, but can I add one more thought real quick on this?
Go ahead. Yeah.
Because we're one of the things that I'm encouraging, I know you do so often, by challenging people to think, don't be misled, right? Ask questions in pursuit of truth. And I think right now we're also in a unique time. I know you have talked about and navigated, we've had other conversations about this as well. It used to be, we could tell people, hey, like, don't listen to what CNN says, like, right? Those are the sources to stay away from. But what I'm seeing now that is something that I think is a maybe deeper concern, is that there are now a lot of voices on the right that are equally misleading. And of course, there's some of the known suspects that you have talked about and identified, and God bless you for having to navigate through some of those evil accusations. But I'm seeing more and more on my social media feed, some of these influencers on the right that are saying things very aggressively and adamantly. And some of what they're saying is not always correct. And I say this because as people that Christians, fundamentally, we should be pursuers of truth. The Bible very clearly holds up a standard of truth, right? Whatever is true, think on these things. Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. That you know the truth sets you free. Truth should be our priority. And truth is not found by listening to a specific voice on social media. Truth should be found as we are pursuing it, going and looking as much, by the way, and I'm going to say this, Frank, to you, because I'm using it as an example, but Frank, when I hear you talk, I don't believe you just because you said it. Now, you use a lot of logic that makes it easy to believe what you say, but I go, man, okay, I'm going to look this up. You are saying truthful things. That's easy for me to confirm what you are saying is truthful, and you're using logic to help me get there. But just because you say it doesn't mean I should believe it. And I'm saying that in the sense of like, just because I know and love somebody, I shouldn't believe it just because they said it. I should be a pursuer of truth. It'd be the same thing for a pastor. I love my pastor. I'm not going to believe everything he says because he said it. I'm going to be like the Bereans from the book of Acts. That's right. And I'm going to say, let me go look this up real quick. Let me make sure it's what it says, because you can have, like either one of us, you can have really good-hearted people that when you talk as much as we do, there are times we probably said something wrong and we didn't mean to say it wrong.
Oh, yeah.
Right? It probably just came out wrong.
Sure.
And we would be.
And if you say it wrong, you're obviously complicit in a murder. That's obvious. That's what people say, right? You know,
bro, God bless you.
If you mix up hospital and hotel, you are a murderer, and we know it. I mean, again, God bless you, bro. It's so stupid, the evil that's out there. But this is why the thing that I encourage, and I know you would too, is that, guys, we want to help you discover truth, and we want to point you in the right direction. And so please go look this stuff up, because God is knowable. American history is knowable. Yes.
And this is where as we are now in a new age where it used to be that there were crazy voices on the left and we're like, stay away from them. Man, there's some crazy voices on the right now. And I am seeing a lot of traction be gained because there are good-hearted people believing things that are not true in a lot of ways. And we're not being pursuers of truth enough. So in the midst of all we're talking about, be careful that you're not swayed either way, that you are grounded in truth and be a pursuer of truth, not just a believer in a voice that you like.
Well said. I want to get some clarity on something because the historical revisionists will say that, the founders were deists or Enlightenment people. They weren't Christians. Your book points out how stupid that is. Okay. Yeah. And back to the original documents. However, there are some questions and maybe even some contradictions that one of them I want you to resolve for us. On one hand, there's something known as the Treaty of Tripoli, and you can tell us what that is here in a minute. But in there, it says America's not a Christian nation, right? On the other hand, you have one of the founders of our nation, the second president, John Adams, writing in 1813 to Thomas Jefferson, who was a previous president, the third president. And he says, our country was founded on Christian principles. So on one hand, Adams is saying, no, we weren't. On the other hand, he's saying, yes, we were. Can you resolve this?
Yeah, so the Treaty of Tripoli is a great one that a lot of anti-Christian founding people, or even Christians who just don't want to support the idea that America was influenced by Christianity, they point to the Treaty of Tripoli. It's an article, I think it's 11, where it says that America was in no sense founded on the Christian religion, and that's the part they use. Now, that's not the whole quote. The whole quote goes on, America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion, that it has in no sense enmity with the Muslim men, and it's like 80-something words is this clause. It's one sentence. So a major run on.
This is because the Barbary pirates, these Muslims, are attacking American shipping in the Mediterranean from Libya, Tripoli. Yeah. And by the way, no extra charge for this, ladies and gentlemen. This is where the Marine Corps hymn comes from.
Yeah, totally correct.
Yeah. From
the halls of Montezuma to the shores of
Tripoli.
All
right, but anyway, Semper Fi.
Okay. So Frank, you set this up great because that's exactly where I'm going to go. So when this is done, John Adams actually was the vice president when it's written. By the time he comes back, he signs it as president. But it's at a time when we separate from Great Britain was the number one military power in the world because they had the number one navy in the world. And they had been at war with some of these Muslim nations for hundreds of years. I mean, literally, that's what the Crusades largely were about. As Muslims were going on conquest, they were trying to conquer Christian areas and nations. What happened in Jerusalem with one of the early Crusades where Christians in Jerusalem were saying, hey, we're under siege. Please come help us. And so you have people go to try to help the Christians that are literally being attacked and murdered and et cetera, et cetera. All this is context that when the Muslims have declared war on what they identified as Christian nations, depending on the year, there was like 8 to 11 nations they said were Christian nations that they're perpetually at war against because it was the conflict of whose religion is going to win. That's what's happening right now. When we separate from Great Britain in 1776, the British Navy no longer protects our trade ships. So starting from 1776, we have trade ships that are going over to Europe that are being intercepted by Muslim pirate ships where our men are being captured, they're being killed, they're being sold into slavery, our goods are being taken. We have a chance to ransom some of them back, but at extortion prices we can't afford. When the revolution is going on, one of the diplomatic missions that happens is John Adams and Jefferson are two. Benjamin Franklin actually goes at one point as well, but they're two of the guys that go, Adams and Jefferson, to go negotiate with the Muslim ambassador of North Africa to go, guys, we're kind of busy right now. Like, what's happening? Can we navigate this? And
what year is this, Tim?
So this is the 1770s. So
we're at war already with Great Britain, and we're sending Jefferson and Adams over to negotiate with Muslims?
So literally the 1770s and the 1780s, we have American ships being attacked by Muslim ships. So during the American Revolution, Adams and Jefferson, one of the assignments they get is, hey, go help us on this. Like, we need help. And this is in the midst of their other assignments. And so they're literally trying to get France to come support us. We're over in England trying to de-escalate. All this is happening. And they are told by the Muslim ambassador that the reason they're making war, because Adams and Jefferson, their big deal is like, guys, we understand you had a problem with Great Britain because, like, y'all got a lot of history with Great Britain. We're not Great Britain. We're actually fighting a war with them. Can we, like, have a peace with you guys? We didn't do anything with you guys. And their ambassador said, and this is Jefferson and Adams writing back to Congress, the ambassador said that their holy book declared that they should make war on all infidels. And the reason they're doing this is because their holy book demands it. And Jefferson's like, that's crazy. Like, there's no way. So Jefferson actually buys his first Quran so he can read for himself what it says. And he's like, it's literally what it says. We start negotiating at that point. We win the revolution. Part of one of the grievances in the Declaration is that we didn't want a standing army. That was one of the reasons we wanted to separate from Great Britain, is they wanted an army in America and they wanted us to fund their army. And we're like, this is silly. Why are we doing this? You're making us, like, house your troops and feed them, and they're taking our goods. All that was an issue. And so to this day, we don't have a standing army. Now, I know a lot of people would be surprised by that because we have a military, and we've had a military like forever, right? But the military is only funded through the National Defense Authorization Act, which happens every 2 years. Our military is only funded every 2 years at a time. If at any point we ever cease to fund our military goes away. So it's not a standing army that's always there subject to, right, the whims of a king or president. All this to say, the Navy was largely disbanded at the end of the American Revolution. We go through the Constitution. We have ships still, awful ships being captured, sailors being sold into slavery or murdered. Washington becomes president in 1789, and Washington as president is still sending diplomats over to negotiate, trying to find peace with these North African Muslim nations. And they continue to attack us. Every time we try to reach a peace agreement, they violate it. They attack more of our ships.
Familiar?
Almost like Iran with President Trump, right?
Yeah,
like,
that sounds familiar, doesn't it?
We're so close, guys.
They can lie to the infidel. Okay, continue.
So one of the great letters from Washington, he says, "Would to heaven that we had a navy to crush these infidels into non-existence." He sends a request to Congress. Will you please give us a navy? So Congress approves and they begin building the navy. But this is when the Treaty of Tripoli happens. We don't have a navy. We are trying to end a war that we are losing trade ships and goods and Americans and sailors, and they're being sold into the slave trade, and they're trying to end it. And so when we are over negotiating with the ambassador of North Africa, I think it was from Algiers, they are doing this treaty. The treaty was initially done in Arabic, which our founding fathers don't read. It was translated, I think it was translated to Italian next, and then ultimately to English. And John Adams, the one he signs the English version. It's also interesting that the Arabic version didn't have that article. It was added later, but it was not added for the reasons people think. What they say in the article is we are not in any sense founded on the Christian religion, as in we have no history of hostility with the Muslim men, meaning we're not one of the crusade nations you guys have been at war with. That was their big argument. Not that we're not founded on the principles of Christianity. We're not one of the Christian crusade nations you've been at war with. And Frank, to go further, I think there were 8 different treaties that we signed with the Barbary Powers nations. This is the only treaty, the Treaty of Tripoli. This is the only one any anti-Christian founding people point to, because it's the only one that has an article like this. In several of the other treaties, it actually identifies that we have Christian men and Christian sailors and Christian boats from a Christian nation. This is the only one that says we're not a Christian nation, which again is why people point to it. But this is one that we're not in control of this one. We're trying to find peace and not lose more men and trade ships and whatever else. And we're just trying to stop whatever we can before we have a Navy. Now, once we have a Navy, once we go to war, and by the way, Jefferson's the one that sends our Navy into war to go try to eradicate this. And the war goes on. We fought the Muslim pirates for over 30 years before we finally had a peace agreement that was kept. And one of the things that Jefferson said that he had learned is that you can only have peace with the Muslims if you pay well or you fight well. And we got tired of paying them, so we started fighting well. And once we showed we were a formidable enough adversary, they stopped attacking us. But all this to say, the Treaty of Tripoli is not what it's made out to be today. But when you divorce it of its context, it sounds very different than what it was. And the reality is it's not at all what it's accused of being today. We have an article on the website that goes kind of a deep dive, and it's documented, footnoted, all back to their original writings, letters, sources. It's a several-page article, but it does give a much better look at what the Treaty of Tripoli is and what it isn't.
Wallbuilders.com, ladies and gentlemen, wallbuilders.com. And then there are academics out there who are, first of all, trying to use the Treaty of Tripoli to say we never were a Christian nation, when in fact that just meant we never were one of the nations, as Tim just said, at war with the Muslims in some sort of crusader sense. But what they completely ignore is, of course, all the quotations from the early church fathers on how they were Christians and all this. But one is particularly precise about how this nation was founded on Christian principles. It comes from John Adams writing to Thomas Jefferson in 1813. What does he say?
He says the general principles and the background context, he's writing Jefferson where he says, I just went to this like college event and saw all these students. He said, it reminded me of us because it was like 40 years earlier when they had first got together. He says, we were so young and ambitious, but I remember when we got together as a group, we were so divided on our sentiments. And he starts reminding how they interacted. And then he talks about where they found the common ground. He says the general principles upon which the fathers achieved independence were not the principles of one specific group. And he goes through, he says it wasn't the principles of the Anglicans or the Episcopalians or the Congregationalists or the Anabaptists. And he lists like 20 different groups. He says, instead, I will say that the principles upon which his fathers achieved independence were the general principles of Christianity. Now, what he's saying is kind of like the C.S. Lewis mere Christianity thing, that is not denominational. It's the ideas from the Christian worldview. That's what they united around, because at the time they came together, they were coming from colonies. Of the original 13 colonies, 9 of them had state-established religions.
That's what people don't understand. Say that again. There were state churches when the First Amendment was ratified.
So correct. And they remained in states, because the First Amendment was a restriction on the federal government, not on the states. States had state established religions at the time of this, but also it's why when you back up and you read the story more. So the very first time the founding fathers ever met or came together was September 6, 1774. There's a great letter from John Adams to Abigail. He writes her the next week, and he's telling her all the things that have been going on. He says, when we first met, he says, Thomas Cushing in Massachusetts, he made the very first motion, and it was that we should open with prayer. But this actually brought some disagreement, because Mr. John Jay of New York and Edward Rutledge of Virginia, they brought up the point, we're not sure that this is going to be very unifying, because we have so many different theological beliefs in the room. Like, we're not sure we can even pray. And he says, but this is when Sam Adams stood up and he said, I am no bigot. And Sam Adams was a noted Congregationalist. The Congregationalists were the descendants of the Puritans and the Separatists, the Pilgrims. But these are the people that had to leave England because of the Anglicans. And Sam Adams says, I am no bigot. And as long as we choose a man who fears God and loves his nation, that man can lead us in prayer. He says, I heard the local pastor, the Reverend Jacob Duché, who was an Anglican minister. Now, Sam Adams, a Congregationalist descendant of the Puritans, is nominated an Anglican, the people that drove his grandparents out of Europe. He's saying, no, as long as he fears God and loves America, we can hear this guy pray. But the reason, again, all this matters is when you start reading what happens. Well, Jacob Duché shows up the next morning. Jacob Duché, it says he led them in prayer, and then he read to them from the collect from the Book of Common Prayer. If you go look up the collect for the day, it was the chapters assigned for the day. there was, I think, 5 or 6 chapters assigned that day, the psalm being Psalm 35. But also, John Adams says that when he showed up, that the Reverend Jacob Shea, he read the prayers for the day, but then he broke out an extemporaneous prayer for at least 10 minutes. One of the other founding fathers there, Silas Dean, said that extemporaneous prayer was so powerful that even the stern Quakers had tears running down their cheeks. And the reason I point all this out is because when people look back and they're like, well, I'm not sure like Christianity really was that influential. When the first motion of the first meeting is to open with prayer, when you bring in the local pastor who reads prayers, who then breaks out an extemporaneous prayer for more than 10 minutes on the extemporaneous prayer alone, and then you read multiple chapters of the Bible, and if you look up all the chapters they read, and you just do like some basic calculation, how long does it take to read this? It's at least an hour and a half they spend in prayer and Bible study, probably closer to 2 hours. And this is actually in the official records of Congress. And that's part of where, when you look at John Adams writing Jefferson, and he says, man, the way we pulled this off, it was the general principles of Christianity. And then when you go back and read the actual story, you realize, yeah, it was the influence of Christianity. It was Christian ideals and philosophy that guided them more than anything else. This was the influence that led them. So then when you get to the Treaty of Tripoli, it says we're not in any sense found in the Christian religion. Well, if you stop there, that's misleading. But if you read the rest of the sentence, that we are not one of the nations that have hostility toward the Muslim men. They're talking about the Crusaders. When you start reading it in context, you realize, oh, it was Christianity that influenced and guided the founding of this nation more than anything else. But they were clarifying for the Muslims, we're not one of the Crusader nations. But also, when the Muslims didn't want to stop fighting, we finally said, okay, we'll do the American way. We're rolling up our sleeves. We're going to war. And finally, we defeated enough Muslims in enough battles that we have peace with them, at least for a time. But what the founding fathers recognized, that I think Americans are only just now rediscovering, is Islam is not compatible with Christianity, and it can't survive in America. And I know that's a big discussion today. And Frank, this is probably a different podcast for another time, because that'd be a totally longer, different conversation.
Yeah, we need to have that conversation at some point, but it's certainly true, because the First Amendment is not a self-defeating amendment. It doesn't give one group the freedom of religion to eradicate the freedom of religion from every other group. And that's precisely what Islam wants to do. So yeah, we got to come back and talk about that more. And what did the founders think of Islam, and how did that fit into the First Amendment and all this? We're going to have to do that another time, but because we still have to get to the stolen land.
Oh, I forgot. We're not done.
Yeah, we still got to do the stolen land objection. And I'm going to come back to Tim in just a minute. I do want to mention, however, that the Bible You Never Knew starts August 3rd. You want to be a part of that. When I learned how Jesus and the apostles interpreted the Old Testament, it just blew me away. And so we put it in an entire course. If you take the premium version, you're going to be with me on several Zoom occasions for live Q&A. So go to crossexamine.org, click on online courses. You will see it there, the Bible You Never Knew. And then don't forget the War on Reality. Part of the War on Reality is people are engaging in historical revisionism. Why is the past always changing? The War on Reality will tell you why. The subtitle, Recovering Truth in a World That Celebrates Lies. And the first chapter tells you what happened with Charlie Kirk that awful day. And then we get into so much more. There goes my phone. Then we get into so much more, including a chapter on cultural Marxism that we're going to send you now if you pre-order the book. If you order the softback copy at Amazon, and just go to thewaronreality.com. It'll tell you how to submit your receipt for that. We're going to send you chapter 10, which is one of the most important chapters in the entire book. It'll help you navigate this whole oppressor category that's going on right now. The War on Reality will show you how to debunk all that and to get people back to evaluating people, just like Martin Luther King said, not on the color of your skin, but on the content of your character. So check all that out. Let me go back to the great Tim Barton here. Tim, we've got to deal with this one last objection. There's so many other objections, but we're running out of time here. We hear this all the time. America is on stolen land. The natives were peace-loving people. We forced them out, and that's wrong. How do you respond?
Yeah, my first question is, who stole the land? And this is really important, because it gives us context for what land are you talking about, right? Because if you say, well, all the land, okay, well, who stole the land? Well, then you have to go back really to where it started. And this is really, really important because if you're going to argue, well, in Jamestown, like they stole Jamestown, that's not really historically correct. But I'm going to give you Jamestown as like, that's a one-off where the people of Jamestown actually were not always great people and they did some bad stuff. So I'm going to let you have Jamestown so you can have one in your tally book, but I'm going to go a different direction. So let's talk about Plymouth for a second. So when the Pilgrims land in Plymouth, as they are in Plymouth, they arrive at a place that is uninhabited. Why is it uninhabited? Because a disease had struck there. That's part of where Squanto's tribe was. There's a whole history behind it. But when they get there, the Pilgrims are in a place that's uninhabited. None of the other tribes wanted to go there because they didn't understand what disease was. They thought maybe that some bad spirits there, so they want to leave the area alone. So the Pilgrims aren't stealing land from anybody because nobody wanted to live there. But the Pilgrims have the longest lasting peace treaty between any colonists, any whites, any Europeans, and any natives in American history. It lasted more than 50 years, was their peace treaty with the Wampanoag Indians. And the reason was because the Pilgrims believed in biblical values of private property, of equality. You can kind of go down the list. But whenever they wanted to expand, they would ask the Wampanoags if they could buy land from them. So the Pilgrims, first of all, didn't steal land, but let's go further. Because if you want to go look at it, okay, so Roger Williams, he goes off to Rhode Island. Like, how does Rhode Island get there? Oh, he buys the land. Connecticut, they bought the land. If you look at William Penn, the founder of Pennsylvania, William Penn was a Quaker. And that's important historic context because Quakers were very devoutly religious people. They were always against slavery. They were always against war. Well, the Quakers in Pennsylvania specifically, the Quakers never had trouble with the native tribes because of the way they treated them. And by the way, for William Penn, and this is something I would encourage people to look up, William Penn bought the same tract of land from 3 different tribes. Now, why would he have to do that?
They kept saying, it's our land. And he said, okay, we'll pay you too.
Because all 3 tribes had been warring over the land before the white settlers got there. But it's important. He bought the land from 3 different tribes because he wanted to clean ownership. And I'm saying this all just giving some small context. When you look at the early colonies, the overwhelming majority of the land was purchased from the natives at a price agreed upon by the natives. To go further, when we become a nation, under the Northwest Ordinance, which is the document that allows all new territories and states to enter the Union, in Article 3, part of the actual Northwest Ordinance says that no land can be taken from any natives without their consent. So literally federal law says you can't just go take from natives. Now, the reason you have to pass a federal law is because there were some colonies where they were trying to do that. They were trying to conquer and drive natives away. And they're like, whoa, we're not going to do that. That's not who we are. We're stopping that right now. They passed a federal law mandating that. It really wasn't until you get to more of like the end of Andrew Jackson. He's the one that kind of laid the foundation for the Trail of Tears. And even that's a little misconstrued historically. But the point is that if you look back, this idea that we stole all the land is historically very, very inaccurate. But also it comes from a very historically dishonest place that the natives were really just peace-loving people who weren't at war with anybody else. And it was the white European settlers who brought war and savagery. That's dumb for so many reasons. And part of why this matters in this context is because if you look at early America, and if we said, okay, wait a second, it's like Tennessee, if the argument was, and it doesn't matter, I'm picking a state, Georgia, Texas, I'm in Texas right now. And Texas, who were the last natives that owned part or had conquered and like territory in Texas? Well, that's the Comanches. Okay, so if the land is stolen from the Comanches, should we give the land back to the Comanches? Well, actually, no. The Comanches conquered over 14 tribes to get the land. Okay, well then which tribe do we give it to? Because those tribes also were at war with other tribes. What we do now is instead of telling just the reality of how history is, and history is messy, and conquest has been the way of the world basically since like Cain and Abel, that's just the way the world has operated. We don't tell an honest story. We only teach it through the lens of the oppressed and the oppressor. And so even in the midst of telling the history of America, we don't talk about the fact that the majority of the land in early America was purchased from settlers at a price agreed upon by the settlers. We only tell the part of the story
by the natives.
I'm sorry.
Price agreed by the natives. Yeah. Right.
Bought by the settlers at a price agreed upon by the natives.
Yeah.
And this is also too, like as a side note, where people might point out, like for the Pilgrims, and they're like, wait a second, but they were buying land for like a cow and a blanket and an axe. And I would go, yes, I understand what you're saying, but here's where also, like, we recognize there's different cultures. And for the native culture, they didn't have the same belief or understanding of land ownership. I get that. They didn't understand you're going to build a settlement and like never leave. I do get that. But also, the way free trade work is at the end of the exchange, both people feel like they've benefited from it, and that's why they agree to it. Because the natives were going home and being like, you're not going to believe what just happened. These people just said they would give us a cow and some blankets and an axe if we just let them build a house over this. Is amazing. Right. Nobody thought they got cheated. The Pilgrims were excited. The Quakers were excited. Wherever they were, there was a free exchange of goods for land. That's the way it was. And again, this is, if you look at the majority of the early colonies, that's the way America got the land. So this idea we stole land, well, who did we steal it from? Were they the first ones to own the land? Well, how did they get the land? It's a dishonest framing of the reality of history, which is it's not clean. It's very messy, even between the native tribes way before there were any European settlers.
All land, well, maybe it's an exaggeration to say all, but most land was gained by conquest, including the land we're on, including the land the Indians were on. Yeah. And the interesting thing is that over here in America, people will say, well, it's wrong for, say, white Europeans to come over here and take land, even though, as you said, in many cases, the white Europeans paid for it. It's stolen land because those natives were here first. But you go over to Israel, and we have evidence that the Israelites were there as early as 1406 BC, the conquest of Jericho. So that's what, over 3,400 years ago. There's never been a state known as Palestine, but somehow Israel has stolen land from a nation that never was, even though Israel has been there since 1406 BC.
Yeah, named after the Greek Philistines.
Yes,
right. Who weren't even Arabic people. Like, right. But yeah, I mean, Frank, why would we assume they're going to be intellectually honest in this whole pursuit? We know that's not correct.
No, and that's part of the problem, and that's what we've been doing in these last two podcasts, is to point out how much historical revisionism is going on. Again, I want to reiterate, we're not trying to sugarcoat American history or even the history of Israel. In fact, the Bible doesn't sugarcoat that. That's one of the reasons we know the Bible's true. It's because they don't tell you what you want to hear. They tell you the truth.
Yeah. As
Dennis Prager famously said, one of the reasons I know the Old Testament is true is because no people group would ever invent such an embarrassing history of themselves, right? I mean, they're Olympic quality sinners over there in the Old Testament. They do everything wrong. They get judged by God several times, and yet they record all this because it's true, right?
Yeah. Well, and I would say that is the duplicate of the American story. In America, man, we are not without sin. Every nation is full of sin. Where America has been uniquely different has been because of the influence of Christians and Christianity and the church.
Yes.
And this is where the things that we can and should celebrate, it's because of the influence of Christianity. And that's why what we encourage and promote is more Christianity. What our nation needs is more Christians who know the Bible, who believe and do what it says. And the better we do, it's like anything you read in the Bible. When people do it God's way, it just works better. And when they don't do it God's way, it brings sin, death, and destruction. America is just like Israel in many regards to that extent. And that's part of what we're pointing out. It's not that America didn't do sin and wicked and evil at times, but that's not the whole story. And if all you're doing is saying that's all we are, then you're being dishonest, and you're actually even making up some things that aren't true to make us worse than we were. No, we're guilty of sin. There's no doubt. But also God used the founding fathers, and really in every generation, he has used leaders and people that believed in him, that knew him and followed him to help overcome error in their generation. And that's our prayer for this generation as well.
Wait, let me get this straight though. I want to make sure that everybody understands what you're saying, Tim. Are you saying that if people love God and love their neighbor, that would make for a better country?
I am saying that in a very bold fashion.
That is radical, bro. Radical. Who knew? Who knew? I love God and love your neighbor seems to surpass bow to Allah and kill your neighbor, right?
Yeah.
So I guess we all have to agree with that, don't we? Come on. So
it would be hard to disagree with it.
Yeah. So it's a pleasure to have you on. Let's reiterate the books because we're just skimming the surface here. We can't cover every nuance and every piece of evidence and objection. Get the book, The American Story, The Beginnings, Part 1. We'll cover from Columbus all the way up to the American Revolution, and then Part 2 goes beyond that. Get Lives, Fortune, and Sacred Honor, 56 signers, both by David and Tim Barton. Also, check out wallbuilders.com. What about social media? Where are you guys on social media, Tim?
Yeah, all over social media. You can look up Wall Builders or Tim Barton on any of those profiles as well. But yes, all over social media. We're posting all the time with stuff like this, telling the stories, trying to help reintroduce people. And to reiterate what you've already said, if you get the books, the reason it's helpful, it's all documented and footnoted. A lot of times having these conversations, I'm trying to recollect to the best of my ability what that exact quote or phrase was. And I might at some point misrepresent or misquote something, not intentionally, just misremembering it. The reason the book is great is we have the actual quote with it footnoted to the original source. So please don't trust me. Don't take my word on it. Go look it up for yourself. And the book is just a helpful way. We've condensed it down for you to find those. You don't have to have it. You can look it up online. Go to founders.archive.gov. You can read from the founders' writings yourself, or you can go to our books where we kind of try to finger point to some of these really great quotes and stories of the founding fathers and the founding of our nation.
Excellent stuff. I wish you were better versed in this, Tim. It would be helpful. It would be helpful if you knew your stuff. It's kind of embarrassing. I got to carry you through this entire podcast.
Thank you, Frank. I appreciate you.
Great stuff, ladies and gentlemen. Check out David and Tim Barton, The American Story, The Beginnings, Lives, Fortune, and Sacred Honor, wallbuilders.com. And if you're ever in the Dallas area, you want to go see some of these documents, if you go to wallbuilders.com, you can see how to do that. All right, friends, great being with you. Lord willing, we'll see you here next time. God bless.
If you're looking for solid answers to life's biggest questions, don't miss the latest episode of I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. Find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Pandora, iHeart, OnePlace, and Podchaser. Tune in, discover the truth, and share it with someone who needs it. Let's keep spreading the truth together.